Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to our meetup today. So the meetup is on Azure Security. So we're excited to have with us today. We have Karl. So Karl Fosaaen. So correct me if I'm pronouncing your last name incorrectly. So usually I have people pronouncing my own last name incorrectly. They call me Okidoki, Okiyoda, which I'm okay with that. But I struggle a little bit to pronounce your last name. So I just call you Fosaaen. Is that good?
Close enough.
Close enough. I'll learn the
Fosaaen.
yeah, I'll learn the
Yep.
pronunciation when you introduce yourself. But we're excited to have Karl with us today. So Karl is one of the few people that I know that focus on offensive cloud security, offensive Azure security. And Karl has content online that you can find. He actually has an amazing tool. So I think is it called it's not Spectre Hot, is it? Is that
the MicroBurst?
MicroBurst is the one. Sorry, apologies. So that's MicroBurst. So that's a very useful tool that was written by Karl. So again, I'll let Karl do a bit of introduction of that himself. But it's one of the few people that I know that actually focus on that area, and it's an area that's constantly growing, and that's one of the reasons why we have this meetup group. Just a quick one to mention that if you're yet to sign up for our next meetup. So we have a next meetup that's arranged for 14th of October. That'll be serverless security automation on Azure, and that'll be taken by Dean Bryant. So Dean is a principal cloud advocate at Microsoft, and he's going to be talking on that topic. But however, for now, I'm super excited about this topic. I'll hand over to Karl, and I'll let Karl just go ahead and just carry on from there. So Karl, I think we'll just bring you in. So over to you.
All right. Well, let me get my desktop shared here.
And I like the dog, by the way.
Thank you. My actual dog is over in the other room at the moment. This is our fake dog. Let me see if I can get the right screen to share.
No problems.
That should be sharing now. You able to see that?
Yes, I can see your screen now, and I'll move that live also. So thanks for that.
Perfect. All right. Well, we can get started here. So I already had a good introduction here, but a little bit of background on myself. I'm a practice director at a company called NetSpy. We're headquartered out of Minneapolis, and I lead up our Portland, Oregon office. I've been out in the Oregon area for about 5 years now, and been with NetSpy for just about 9 years now. But I do a little bit of everything at the company. Currently lead up our cloud pen testing team and the team out of the Pacific Northwest. But I've done social engineering, internal pen test, external pen test, mobile and web app testing over the years. Pretty wide variety of things over the last 10 plus years I've been doing pen testing. But for the last few years, I've really been focusing on cloud pen testing, leading up our cloud pen testing team. And I would say that one of my core focus areas is really Azure pen testing, as we've got a couple of clients that are very heavily focused in Azure at the moment, and they get to spend a lot of time in different subscriptions. But you can find me on the NetSpy blog at blog.netspy.com, where I'm pretty much mostly talking about Azure-related security things. Outside of being a cloud enthusiast, in my spare time, I also spend time in the clouds as a private pilot. You can also find me on Twitter at @kfosaaen. Again, it's tweeting more about Azure security stuff for the most part, but like to keep in the loop about most kind of security things, so you can find me on Twitter there. So I think as anybody that's going to be watching this will know, everybody's currently moving to the cloud. Azure is a great option for organizations that are looking to move to the cloud, just given the benefits of Azure Active Directory, kind of the easy syncing between on-premise environments and cloud environments. We're finding that a lot of our clients are really adopting Azure as their primary cloud, just because it's very easy to sync up with, and it offers one-stop licensing for things like Office 365. I think anybody that's on this call that's interested in Azure security is probably well aware of this, but we as pen testers are also very interested in moving to the cloud, as all of these resources are moving to the cloud. and we'll benefit from the scalability and just the availability of these cloud services that we can make use of for pen testing. But for the talk today, we'll be talking about privilege escalation scenarios that we frequently see within Azure environments and kind of how we make use of those. But a little bit of primer on this. If anybody wants to go ahead and screenshot this right now, there's a couple of different talks that are really good touch points or reference points for a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about today. I'm assuming that if you're here for Azure Security Meetup, chances are that you've got some familiarity with either of these talks or some of these security concepts. So hopefully everybody's got their screenshot. These slides will be available after the talk as well, but I'd recommend just giving those a quick watch for additional background for some of the stuff we'll talk about today. So in the intro, talked a little bit about MicroBurst here, but the GitHub link is up at the top here, and really this is a set of PowerShell functions that I've put together that wrap a number of different PowerShell modules, be it the AZ or Azure AD or MS Online PowerShell modules to automate some of the processes that we do during an Azure pen test. A couple of these key ones, get AZ passwords, we'll talk about in depth later on here, but it helps extract passwords from different services within Azure, getting AZ domain info, really dumping out users, resources, IAM type configurations from that Azure subscription, MSOL domain info. We'll talk about what happens if you don't have Azure subscription access and you want to try and escalate your kind of Azure AD presence. That's another script that helps collect a lot of that information, leads to that. And then a couple of anonymous enumeration scripts here as well. We've got a handful of other scripts that are available there, but if any of this is interesting for you, I'd recommend going and checking out the GitHub. So before we get into privilege escalation, let's talk real quick about how we get credentials in the first place. So from a NetSpy perspective, I do a cloud pen test for a lot of our clients where it's an authenticated pen test against that cloud environment where we're starting with credentialed access. Typically, we'll have Azure Active Directory credentials. We'll be able to dump out configurations from that Azure subscription and then start diving deeper into the externally facing services and the just general cloud platform services that are available and doing pen tests against those available services. Well, if you're on an external pen test, or maybe you've got your own credentials for your own organization and you want to assess your level of access within your Azure subscription, what we typically do from a NetSpy standpoint on an external pen test is try to gather credentials from external sources, be it keys that are leaked out through GitHub, Pastebin, any other public repository, or guessing credentials. I initially put these slides together about a year ago, and I was staying at a hotel that had lemonade, and thought it was kind of funny that during that time frame, we were guessing summer 2019 as one of the more common passwords for guessing credentials. So, from our external perspective, we're enumerating email addresses that would be used to log into Office 365 or the Azure Portal and guessing credentials from there. A lot of great tools out there to try those credentials, but once we've guessed those credentials, we'll typically access the Azure Portal just directly through the website or through the CLI or PowerShell modules at that point. Additionally, we can make Graph API calls, and we could probably spend a whole talk talking about tokens and what you can do with access tokens from there. But kind of initial entry points into an Azure environment from our perspective is either guessing credentials, or for a cloud pen test, we've already been given an Azure Active Directory user. So quick rundown of the permissions model for everybody, so everybody's kind of on the same page. This really applies to the core roles that are part of the IAM model for Azure. And we'll talk about this kind of at multiple different levels, but there are corner cases with custom roles that are created or custom policies that may give specific access rights to specific users. But in this case, we'll just kind of focus on the core reader, contributor, owner, and then kind of higher up at the tenant level, global admin, user access administrator, those types of tenant level roles. But for the most part, within Azure Subscriptions, you have three primary IAM roles that are applied. Reader being a read-only account that really just has read access to configurations and services. Contributor, who's allowed to make changes to those specific resources or resources under a resource group or subscription. And then owner, who has all of those rights, but also has rights to delegate access to other users, as in assigning contributor access to another Azure Active Directory user. Like I said, there's other special custom roles that we run into. When we do our cloud pen test, we actually audit those specific custom roles to make sure that somebody didn't create a custom role that accidentally exposes too much functionality, the Microsoft authorization star or something like that, that might allow for excessive permissions or allow for a privilege escalation scenario. So these roles can be applied at a number of different levels. Like I said, if you're in an Azure security meetup here, you're probably familiar with all of this, but with the kind of descriptions that we'll use today, we'll be talking about really the application at the subscription level. For the most part, with subscriptions that I'm dealing with, roles are typically applied at that level. It's pretty rare to see them at the asset level. It's occasionally set up where specific users will have resource group level reader contributor type policies applied, but for the most part, what I'm seeing is subscription level application of those roles. So just kind of a quick spot check for anybody that does have existing credentials. There's a number of different ways that you can access or list out the permissions that you have. If you have AZ CLI access, as in the command line interface, there's a couple of commands here to list out all of the available roles, along with the roles that are applied to your specific user. Personally, I normally have Azure Portal access, so I just hop into the Subscriptions tab and review the subscription IAM permissions there. And that'll give you a good idea of what subscriptions you have access to once you have access to an account. We'll talk about it at the owner level, but quite frequently we'll run into Azure Active Directory accounts that have multiple subscriptions, and maybe they only have contributor on one, but they have owner level on another, which could allow us to pivot to other subscriptions there. And then kind of in addition to that, if you've got Azure Portal access, just taking a look at the Azure Active Directory section within the portal, which really outlines the different roles and administrators that are available. So kind of your common built-in roles, global admins, those types of roles. So for the presentation here, we're actually going to go from bottom to top here, where we go from no Azure access, as in we've got an Azure Active Directory user that does not have any subscriptions applied, but they have access to some of the resources and abilities of an Azure Active Directory account will give them. Moving up through reader, contributor, and or some contributor rights. It's kind of a gray area there where we may kind of sort of have contributor rights on things. We'll talk about that when we get there. Owner level, and then finally up to tenant or global admin level. So to start things off, we'll go back to our scenario of password guessing. And this is actually quite common for us, where we'll guess a summer 2020 or autumn 2020, because that's probably long enough to meet most password length requirements. We'll guess one of those credentials and get access to the Azure portal. But when you start clicking around, you don't really see anything there. It's kind of just the empty Azure portal. You don't have any subscriptions. There's nothing really there for you. So we have this marked as no Azure access, but we do have an Azure Active Directory user. Or potentially the Azure AD portal is restricted. We do have some other valid options that we can start pivoting through to potentially escalate our privileges and find options to get other credentials or get access to other services, I guess, hosted through Office 365 or Azure. So we have valid credentials. We can also move through Office 365 through the Microsoft Online PowerShell commandlets, dumping out information like list of users, groups, any other kind of sensitive data points that we'd be able to collect to potentially guess additional passwords or potentially move through single-factor authentication interfaces. With an external pen test, we're still quite frequently finding single-factor VPN, where we guess credentials through a Microsoft portal use those same credentials for Active Directory, which is synced on premise. And although we don't have Azure access, we're still able to VPN into the internal network and then potentially escalate our way up there. If the end goal is Microsoft Azure access, we escalate internally and then kind of pivot our way over to the Azure portal. One thing to note, if anybody's unfamiliar with the myapps.microsoft.com, really handy to identify which apps you've authenticated for your Azure Active Directory user or have access to. From our perspective, as we're doing a pen test, we like to go to that site to see what single sign-on authentication interfaces we have available. So a couple of negatives here. There's not a ton of valuable information available from Azure at this point. If we don't have a subscription applied, we can't list out specific resources or much outside of Azure Active Directory. Office 365 instead, we're able to dump out a lot of information there that, if we guess one credential and have a limited list of users to guess credentials against, if we've got MSOL access, we can dump out all of the email addresses in the domain and try and guess more credentials from there. So this is kind of a boring, more external pen test focus slide up front here, but let's get into reader access. So I will say that reader level access is less commonly granted within Azure subscriptions. I'd say for the most part, people that are using the services or creating within the platform typically have contributor or owner level rights. I see the occasional user with reader level access, and it's more from an audit perspective to maybe assess the number of services that are available within a specific subscription, maybe pull billing information, anything like that. But with reader level access, we have rights to read out all of the resources in the subscription. And not to go back to password guessing again here, but if it's effective once, it might be effective again. Now that we've got full access to read the Azure Active Directory, we're able to do password guessing against additional accounts in that Azure Active Directory. One of the easiest escalations I've run into was I had reader level access on a subscription, dumped out all of the global admins for that tenant and did password guessing with the company name and the number 1 afterwards, and was able to find, I believe, 6 out of their 10 global admins had the same password, and none of them were configured with multi-factor authentication. So definitely something to look out for in your Azure tenants, making sure that there's strong credentials applied, conditional access, multi-factor authentication, really protect those global admin accounts, because this is a perfect example of where we were very easily able to escalate for a client of ours that makes pretty heavy use of Azure subscriptions. So something to look out for there. But one of the kind of common go-tos that I have when I'm just sitting with reader level access is Docker registries. So Azure Container Registries within Azure allow for subscription readers to pull any ACR images. So all we have to do with reader rights is authenticate to that Azure Container Registry and then start pulling down images. The number of clear text credentials, storage account access keys, all sorts of different interesting credentials that end up within these Azure containers or Azure container images. It's astounding. So almost every time we get access to a container registry, there's at least one credential that we end up finding in a container image. So pretty standard process for us. We authenticate, pull down the image, review it for credentials, and then use those credentials from there to potentially escalate. Something to look out for in your own organization. I've seen it where excessive permissions are being applied to the ACRs themselves, allowing users that really shouldn't have read-only access to it, given specific Azure Active Directory groups reader access on those services. Definitely something to look out for there. Another interesting thing is taking the deployment parameters for Azure resource deployments and pulling out the parameter values. I think I'm hopefully not the only one here who's played around with deployment templates before and accidentally put a password. As we can see at the bottom here, admin password is this clear text. Playing around with those parameters, trying to automate deployments or really pipeline those resource deployments, you end up potentially making shortcuts here and there, playing around with the deployment files themselves, what we find is that that's the case for a lot of organizations where they may have been playing around with deployment files before they got to their kind of final prod deployment. And if we go far enough back in the resource groups, we can see the deployment parameters for the first time that they launched a virtual machine, and they happen to launch it with a clear text password as the value here. So the mitigation here is pretty easy. Use secure strings in those templates instead. And if you go through any of your deployments, we have a command here to pull out the resource groups. And I should probably update these for the updated commandlets, sorry. But basically pull the list of the resource groups, pipe that into the Git resource group deployments, and basically review the parameters there. But if you do have any residual clear text passwords in there, make sure that you change those local administrator passwords or database connection strings, anything else like that that you happen to find there. So from our perspective, we might be able to take these local administrator passwords for a virtual machine and use them to log into VMs with RDP exposed out to the internet. From an internal perspective, if you've got an internal attacker that's trying to pivot into those virtual machines, same deal. So speaking of virtual machines, we'll talk about managed identities, and this is kind of a reader, kind of sort of contributor level. With contributor level, you'll have rights to run code or run specific commands against those virtual machines. But at a reader level, you may actually have RDP access to a specific system if it's, say, domain joined and they've got you in a specific group for that. We see kind of occasional interesting situations with managed identities and virtual machines, but it's kind of a good transition point between the two here. So with managed identities, you can think of it as, if anybody's more familiar with AWS, kind of like EC2 instance roles, but for Azure virtual machines. Really, it's applying a specific identity to a virtual machine so that you can access resources within the Azure subscription. We typically see this as a managed identity with access to contributor on the subscription. I don't know why, but for some reason that seems to be the most common usage of managed identities within virtual machines. But once you have access to that virtual machine, you can act as that virtual machine from a managed identity perspective, meaning you inherit the IAM permissions for that managed identity within the subscription. So if you've got RDP access, PS remoting, any kind of remote code execution or command execution on there, if there's application or patch issues, let's say it's a virtual machine that's hosted out to the internet running a web server and we find a code injection there, we can then get access to that virtual machine and then get access to that managed identity. In terms of authenticating, let's say that you've got a command prompt in front of you there. If you use the AZ CLI with AZ login -- identity, from that virtual machine, that allows you to log into the AZ CLI as that managed identity. Likewise, with the REST APIs, you're able to hit up the Azure metadata service to request an OAuth token for that managed identity. I've got some examples here on the related blog. But using the REST APIs to grab that token, in the case that, let's say it's a contributor on the subscription, the next place I would most likely go is pulling out the storage account keys via the REST APIs, storage accounts that that contributor has access to, and then start going through those storage accounts. If the managed identity is an owner of the subscription, which is something I've run into in the past, I've got a sample script that's linked to in this blog that allows you to escalate your own Azure Active Directory user up to an owner level account using those REST APIs. So kind of a handy way to escalate here. And again, this is kind of bordering on reader and contributor level access. Sometimes we run into reader accounts that have RDP access into the virtual machines, and those may have managed identities applied. So kind of a quick example here. Let's say that we've got reader level credentials that we've guessed from an external pen test. That user's got subscription reader rights, and the deployment parameters expose local admin credentials for a domain joined virtual machine. So we're able to access that virtual machine from an external network because somebody really needed to RDP into that box and opened up everything from all zeros through all 255s on their NSG rule. And now we're able to get local admin access onto that virtual machine. If anybody's familiar with Mimikatz, we're able to use that to pull out credentials for a contributor account that's currently logged into that virtual machine. And now we have contributor level access on the subscription. Alternatively, if that virtual machine was configured with a managed identity and we were able to RDP into that virtual machine, assume the role of the managed identity there, we also would have contributor access at that point too. So now that we have contributor access, if that's at the subscription level, that's great. We're able to manage everything in the subscription from a contributor level, allows us to do a lot and gives us a lot of surface area to move around with. From an individual resource group level, it's not too bad. We might have some options in terms of potential escalations, maybe automation accounts that we'll talk about later with excessive permissions on there. Maybe there's some credentials stored somewhere. We'll have some stuff to work with. Every once in a while, we'll run into a contributor for a single resource. They just have contributor on one virtual machine and that's about it. That's nice, but from a privilege escalation standpoint, there's not a whole lot that we might be able to do there. So let's start with virtual machines here. We talked about managed identities and how that could be abused. What I kind of moved over very quickly is the fact that if you have contributor level access on the virtual machines, you're running commands as NT authority system or root for Linux systems on those virtual machines. So this is extremely powerful. We frequently see domain controllers that are put in Azure as kind of a backup domain controller, or maybe they're specifically configured for that Azure environment to act as a domain controller so that they can serve domain services for the other virtual machines in that virtual network. But anybody that has contributor on that domain controller effectively has domain administrator as they're executing commands as NT authority system on those virtual machines. So this is hugely impactful. If we're able to get contributor in a subscription, it's pretty much an immediate step to get to domain admin. And we can talk about escalating down onto on-premise networks later, but we could potentially escalate our way down to the on-premise network, sync up hashes there, get access to other on-premise resources, all sorts of fun stuff. So alternatives, instead of just domain controllers being on the virtual machines, any other systems that are in there as virtual machines, we want to potentially pivot through those different virtual machines as a contributor and be able to run commands against those virtual machines, either gathering credentials if things are domain joined, or we're able to pull other Azure Active Directory credentials. We're potentially able to get access to higher privileged accounts. Like we talked about with running Mimikatz on a virtual machine in the escalation here, we've run into situations where owner accounts, global admin accounts are RDP'd directly into a virtual machine. We're able to pull out their credentials relatively easily. So a couple of related blogs here from the NetSpy blog, just on command execution through virtual machines there. So another great spot as a contributor for potentially escalating privileges or gathering credentials is storage accounts. So within the blob storage or file share storage, we frequently find configuration files, passwords, keys, Excel spreadsheets of backups for passwords, all sorts of interesting things. If they're utilizing any of these storage accounts for Office documents, you could potentially make those malicious Office documents, getting access to really sensitive information there. One note for kind of red team phishing type exercises, storage accounts are great for payload storage and delivery. Since everything's being hosted through a Microsoft URL, the storage accounts don't frequently get flagged for malicious content unless it's something blatant, payload.exe, something like that. But the likelihood for that URL to be allow listed through some type of web content filter is much higher due to the fact that everything's being hosted through Azure. So another kind of interesting part about storage accounts is the Azure Cloud Shell. I I can't really do a show of hands here, but show of hands of folks that use Azure Cloud Shell. I wouldn't be surprised if a large number of people are making use of that. It can be a handy way to manage Azure environments directly from the web browser, but it does this with an ext2 file system that is stored in a file share. So you go into the Azure portal, you load up your Cloud Shell, that loads up a container with this specific file system in it. And what we can do as contributors is actually have write access to that file system. So what we're able to do as a pen tester is download that ext2 file system, modify it on our end. And what I'd recommend from a pen test perspective is modifying both bash RC and the PowerShell profile. So that depending on which Cloud Shell profile they're bringing up, either Bash or PowerShell, it's going to execute commands in that session regardless. So what we've done, and the attached blog post here will outline that, is pulled down that ext2 file system, added malicious commands. In our case, I think we did proof of concept, add a new user or make this user an owner in the subscription, and then uploaded that ext2 file system back up to the storage account. And then the next time that Cloud Shell session is executed, those commands get run. The kind of fun execution on this is you could potentially phish a user into opening up that Cloud Shell again. If you send that global admin after you've modified their profile, a quick phishing email saying, hey, your Azure Cloud Shell will be expiring in the next week. If you don't access it now to make sure that you maintain your Azure Cloud Shell before we clean it up. It's a good way to get a user to go into that Cloud Shell session. Another kind of interesting thing that ends up either being stored in storage accounts or just getting access to the virtual disks with contributor level access is being able to copy off Azure Virtual Machine disks where we can pull off hashes, additional files that might be stored. This could be a whole nother presentation in and of itself, but there's the cloud copy attack, static flow on Twitter. We've got all of the GitHub info here. It's basically getting access to a domain controller's hard drive through the Azure portal or through the Azure platform and pulling down the password hashes for the domain from all of that. Really handy if you get access to a domain controller or a domain controller disk within Azure. So the next part here is really encompassed by the Get AZ Passwords password collection module within MicroBurst. And within that module, we're able to dump a large number of different passwords that are stored in Azure. Again, this could be a presentation all in of itself, but we'll touch very highly at the Get AZ Passwords function here. With contributor level access to things like key vaults, app services, automation accounts, we're able to access any credentials that those specific services have access to. So dumping things like key vault entries, deployment credentials or connection strings for app services. I linked to a recent blog post that I put out that shares some kind of similar threads to a presentation David did recently. But I linked to the blog post here that talks about escalating in app services. So within app services, we can pull deployment credentials, getting access to the website code or potentially secrets that are available there, connection strings that would be part of that deployment profile, and being able to pivot to other services there. All of that's really outlined in this blog post, so I'd recommend going and reading that. And then automation accounts, there's a number of different ways that we can store credentials or use credentials within automation accounts. They're typically set up as contributors by default on the subscription. I have seen them in multiple cases being set up with much higher permissions to allow for some of the automation efforts that are going on in that environment. But we can also pull back clear text credentials for any stored credentials or for the run as credentials that these automation accounts are running as. So as a contributor, we can use Get AZ Passwords to pull all of these credentials out of these different services and potentially use those to move over to other services. So specifically to automation accounts, we do frequently find that the automation accounts are configured with Key Vault access. And while contributors are allowed to modify access policies for Key Vaults, we typically try to do mostly read-only testing in our Azure Cloud pen tests. So we typically don't modify those Azure Key Vault policies, as that would be kind of a major state change and kind of changes things once we have contributor access. So we like to make use of existing accounts that have access to those Key Vaults to show kind of proof of concept, lateral movement. And we frequently find automation accounts configured with access to Key Vaults. There's a CVE attached to this from last year where if you accidentally configured your automation account with excessive access on some of these Key Vault entries, Microsoft put out a script to detect where you might have some excessive permissions there and help you correct some of those issues with automation accounts having access to Key Vaults. So from our perspective, we're more likely to make use of excessively permissioned or privileged automation accounts to escalate our own account within the subscription. So let's say the automation account that runs the runbooks is configured with owner permissions on the subscription. We as a contributor can modify or create a new runbook that has commands that execute as that owner account. You basically authenticate as that owner in the runbook and then say, hey, let's make the Fosaaen account an owner of the subscription, and we're able to run as that privileged user. May just seem like a misconfiguration here, but we do really see this. It's quite frequent that owner permissions are being applied through automation accounts, as the automation accounts are set up to modify different parameters within that subscription. And it is definitely a user misconfiguration that we run into quite frequently. So to continue our reader level example from before, we've got access with a contributor account. We've got access to automation accounts, and we've used the get Azure passwords to dump out owner level credentials that are stored from the automation account stored credentials. Now this could either be clear text credentials that are stored as a credential object within the automation account, or the run as certificates for that automation account specifically, which we could then use with the Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell modules to log in from a command line perspective and make owner level changes from that. So we now have owner level access. So with owner level access, we're able to do everything that we could do as a contributor, but now we're able to modify those permissions for that subscription. As I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of times these accounts are set up with additional subscriptions. So from our perspective, we typically scope these out for a handful of subscriptions or a specific subscription that we're testing for a client. So the other subscriptions may be out of scope, but if it's an external pen test, we've worked our way up through one subscription, we want to escalate into others and try and escalate on the Azure subscription or Azure tenant as part of kind of the proof of concept. We might move to other subscriptions in the environment. So typically at owner, we'll start moving to other subscriptions and trying to find where, say, a global admin credential or some type of tenant administrator account is logged into virtual machines or configured with clear text credentials somewhere that we can steal. It's pretty much just go through each different subscriptions, repeating the same process and really working our way through the different subscriptions. One thing to note is if we're getting access to owner accounts for other subscriptions as we're pivoting through, at a certain point, there's going to be kind of an overlap between the different subscriptions. And if we've got owner access on all of the subscriptions, we're effectively owner everywhere, which is not quite full effective tenant admin. We don't have rights to create new users, anything like that. But as soon as one of those tenant level administrators logs in somewhere, we might be able to access that session or get access to credentials there. My personal recommendation is take a look out for the Cloud Shell storage in each of the subscriptions for anywhere that one of the global admins has a Cloud Shell stored. Typically, they're storage accounts labeled with CS up front. They're pretty easy to identify. And once you go into the file shares attached to that storage account, it should be pretty easy to find where those global admins are storing those files. So like I said, it's kind of repeat through this process until we get access to higher level credentials or until we're kind of satisfied with where we're at. From an owner level access scenario where we've got on-premise Active Directory in scope, it may actually just be more efficient for us to be in a subscription that has a direct connect or express route connection back to the on-premise environment, use any existing Azure Active Directory credentials we have to then go down onto the on-premise environment, escalate our privileges there. Once we've got domain administrator at the domain level, or down at the on-premise level, we're able to dump out password hashes that are then synced back up with the Azure Active Directory environment. And if MFA is not required, or we have conditional access that potentially allows us to access the environment with single factor authentication, then we're able to pivot back up into the Azure environment with a privileged connection. Blog post to note here for escalating internally. SpectreOps put out a blog post probably 3 weeks ago about using Endpoint Manager to execute commands down on on-premise Active Directory systems. Super effective, really handy way to pivot down onto on-premise Active Directory environments if there's no direct connect or express route connection connecting back onto the on-premise environment. So another kind of interesting corner case that we've run into here, utilizing custom roles and or SharePoint admin access roles that would allow for adding users to Azure Active Directory groups or Office 365 groups. If any groups are being used for subscription IAM management, there is potential that you'd have access to a role that allows you to add your user to a specific group, which then that group inherits those rights of that specific subscription role. That gives you access to the resources that you want to get access to. We've seen it where Azure Active Directory or Office 365 groups are being used for subscription owners across the board. So once we added our user to a specific Office 365 group with a SharePoint admin credential that we compromised, we're able to get owner level access across all of the subscriptions at that point. There's custom roles that might be vulnerable to this. There's also the dynamic groups. I definitely recommend checking out the related blog down here from Mnemonic. They talk about abusing those dynamic groups in Azure to potentially escalate your privileges or get yourself added to a specific group. In my case, I've really only run into dynamic groups that add phones to conference rooms. So we could change our users so that it could be a conference room. But outside of that, I haven't had a ton of luck with that yet, but looking forward to being able to practically use that in an engagement. So I want to be respective of everybody's time here. I think we're at about 50 minutes here. Last 10-ish slides here should go relatively quick.
Yep, so Karl, yes, you're right. So we do have like, let's say roughly about 10 minutes, then we can have some time for questions at the end. So, but that's absolutely fine. So it's going well.
Perfect. Just want to make sure I'm not running over anybody's other meetings or anything else that they have going on. So at kind of the tenant level admin, we want to talk about kind of persistence and maintaining that access. Once we get global admin or access to all of the subscriptions, what do we do? Well, if we're being malicious, we could just burn everything down and delete everything and cause major service disruptions. We're pen testers and we don't want to do that. We want to be, good and not break things, not cause major outages. So potentially pivot internally through the channels that we had talked about. We definitely want to try and persist access in the subscriptions that we have access to, assuming this is some type of pen test or red team operation where we want to maintain that access to look for additional issues or getting access to specific data stores, anything like that that we may want to gain access to. So in terms of persisting that, adding Active Directory accounts is kind of handy. You could create something that looks like a legitimate username in that environment, following conventions for username naming. If it's first initial last name dot last name, anything like that. You could either own all of the subscriptions with that account or create a custom role that really mimics the attributes of, say, global admin and apply that custom role. There's a lot of different ways that you could persist with individual Azure Active Directory accounts. I included a couple of one-liners here to list out all of the subscriptions, and then if you pipe those into the following command there, that adds that specific user that you would replace username here with to the owners group for all of those subscriptions. So a quick way to own all of those at that point. Guest access in a very similar way. If guest users are permitted for the Azure Active Directory tenant, you could create, say, a lookalike email domain, maybe take a look at the vendors. If you've got a specific ISP or internet service provider that may look like a legitimate, ISP vendor, something like that. It's a good way to kind of hide in those guest users and then apply appropriate IAM assessments or assignments that you need for that specific tenant. You could potentially create your own subscription. The only really practical use that I found for this would be for a malicious attacker that wants to spin up their own specific subscription for things like crypto miners or malicious payloads being delivered, anything like that. Not really practical from a pen test perspective, but if there were malicious actors that are looking to use your Azure resources for something malicious, creating an additional subscription that's kind of walled off from everybody else to do those activities might be a potential. I don't really see that happening, but never know. Much quieter options would be creating service principal, automation accounts, application accounts with excessive privileges applied. And again, that could be a whole nother presentation there. We'll kind of wrap things up here on automation accounts. I do really like the functionality that's available within automation accounts, but what I've found is that they're often misconfigured and they're often usable within a privilege escalation perspective, be it credentials, be it the applied roles and automation accounts in the environment and being able to abuse those. From a persistence perspective, we could add runbooks that are triggered by webhooks, add runbooks that run on a specific cadence that do things that we want. So we could create an automation account with our high permissions here that has user admin applied to it so that it's able to create new users within that automation account runbook. We could just have that triggered to run once a day or through a webhook and create a new Active Directory user for you, add all of the applicable permissions that you want, and then give you access to that remotely. It's just kind of a potentially handy way for maintaining or persisting in an Azure environment. From a practicality standpoint, we don't have to use this all that often with our cloud pen tests as we already have access to the environment. But from a more of a red team perspective, this could be kind of handy. This is really just kind of a quick rundown of what a webhook call would look like in PowerShell here to create a blog demo user here with password 123. And we have a quick little video here of that. So we've created that malicious runbook. We've created a webhook for that to run that. We execute that in PowerShell here, and then we're able to log in remotely through the PowerShell commandlets. And we can see that we'll have to change our password from password 123 here as it's a brand new account and it requires it to update the password. So potentially handy way for persistence here, but yeah. Last kind of concept I've thrown together here, because I think it's kind of interesting and could be kind of a fun scenario to set up, is setting up a watcher in the runbook so that, as a runbook runs every X number of minutes, it checks to see if an Azure Active Directory user has been removed. If that user is removed, then run another runbook to add that user back. Alternatively, you could create multiple automation accounts that just watch each other. And then if one of those automation accounts gets deleted, the other automation account adds that automation account back, and they keep adding each other back, forever as they're both getting deleted, assuming that they catch each other getting deleted. And then those runbooks add that user, and it maintains this kind of weird persistence. I think everybody's probably run into a situation where they've tried to delete something from Azure, and it might take a little while. I don't even want to bring up the outages that we ran into yesterday, but from an admin perspective, you may try to delete a runbook or anything like that, and it may just kind of hang for a minute and not go. I could see this being a potential persistence option to keep those runbooks alive in that account. So really loud options that we typically wouldn't do, but adding specific extensions to kind of backdoor virtual machines. You can add command and control, adding extensions that automatically add local admin, or potentially opening up specific firewall rules, templating all of that stuff, automating all of that, and just kind of keeping that going from a persistence standpoint. From a pen test perspective, we typically don't have to worry about all that. But from an attacker who really wants to maintain access to that environment, they could potentially do something like that. So I think we're real close on time here, but just kind of links to some of the related blogs here, and I guess I'll open things up for questions.
Hello, Karl. That was awesome. That was awesome. So I was just following up on Twitter as we were speaking and just taking some of the funny screenshots of what you were saying and just posting that on Twitter. So that was an awesome presentation. So I think I have a few questions here for you also. So the first question that someone asked was, are they going to be getting the slides? So are we going to be getting the slides after this?
Yep. So I typically publish those through slideshare.net.
Yeah.
And if you find me on Twitter, pretty much these are slightly modified from the ones that I have as a pinned tweet. But if you go find me on Twitter, the top pinned tweet there should be the link to the version of this I did for DerbyCon last year. There's only a couple of minor adjustments here.
Nice.
For updated slides here.
Yeah, and for those that are wondering, so you can see Karl's Twitter handle on the screen. So that's Fosaaen. So do use that to reach out to access the document that Karl is referring to. So here's another question that I've got for you, Karl. So because I know that a lot of this research, amazing research and amazing content. So are you seeing sort of like an increase in people exploiting management groups in terms of using that to move laterally across subscriptions, like within some of the engagements that you're doing?
That is a really good point. I had hoped to have a little bit more time to update my slides to include that, but I have seen that personally in a couple of recent engagements as more people are making use of the management groups within Azure to manage multiple subscriptions at once. We found some really interesting misconfigurations. We found one a couple of weeks ago where a specific user was set up with contributor rights on all of the subscriptions just by kind of default when those subscriptions were originally created. And then when those subscriptions were brought up under a management group, for some reason, that specific management group, they were given owner level access to the management group, which that then cascades down into the individual level subscriptions. So that user, once we got access to it, was then able to have owner level access for all of the subscriptions at that point.
Nice. Wow. That looks like it's going to be a tough bit. Nice. So, okay, so final question for you, Karl. So if someone wants to learn more about this, so it's one of the questions that I get asked all the time, right? And I really struggle to answer, so maybe you have a better answer than I do. So people ask me all the time, I want to really get involved in offensive cloud security, right? Not just like learning best practices, but I want to get involved in offensive cloud security. How do I get started? What materials, what resources can you point me to? Where do I start? What would be your suggestion to that?
That is a bit tough. I do feel like we're in a very small group in terms of Azure security. I feel like there's only a handful of us that really focus deep dive on that. But there's a handful of people that I'd recommend via Twitter. That's really where I get most of my information. A lot of the stuff that I'm retweeting or sharing there is stuff from other people that are really focusing on Azure research. So that's always a good option. We really like to share stuff on the NetSpy blog, as we've added all of that stuff here. I'd say most of the stuff I get is from Twitter. In terms of kind of book resources, the Attacking Azure Applications from No Starch, Matt Burrows, that one's really solid. There's a little bit of out-of-date stuff with some of the Azure RM stuff, but at a core fundamentals, understanding kind of the security concepts there, that's really good. It explains a lot of the kind of IAM related issues that you might run into from an Azure perspective. That really helped me get a better understanding of all of that.
Nice. No, thanks very much. And the final question that I have for you is from Dan G. So Dan asked the question on, based on your engagement experience, what are the top 3 privilege escalation attacks?
Definitely clear text credentials stored in automation accounts. We'll frequently find automation runbooks that are configured to take in a credential from a stored credential for the runbook and run other services with that credential. So we'll frequently find clear text credentials there that allow us to escalate I'd say virtual machines that are configured with managed identities. We're seeing a lot more of that lately. And for some reason, people really like to give owner level permissions for that. So that's been kind of a common thing we've run into. And for that, really just getting access to a contributor account or a RDP user that has RDP access into that system. And I would say either containers or deployments parameters, like we talked about in the reader level section, finding clear text credentials in the container images or clear text credentials in deployment parameters. Those are also very common.
Nice. We're just right on time here. That was awesome, Karl. So I personally am looking forward to going over the recording again and just taking all the different scenarios that you've highlighted and just tearing them apart and reproducing them. So personally, I'm looking forward to doing that myself. Again, thanks very much for honoring this request and coming over to speak to the group. And also to the rest of the group, the recording will be posted on the Meetup page and on YouTube afterwards. Again, thanks very much, Karl. And to everyone, see you next time. Have a lovely week, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.